And as we sit, shall we just pray? Heavenly Father, again we pray for your Holy Spirit to guide us in our thinking for the good of your church and all the people amongst whom we live, for Jesus' sake. Amen. Well, there's nothing new under the sun. The doctrines of true religion are overthrown. The laws of the church are in confusion. There is a complete lack of men shepherding the Lord's flock with knowledge. Just judgment is a thing of the past, and everyone walks according to his heart's desire. Vice knows no bounds. The people know no restraint. Well, so wrote Basil the Great in the 4th century in his letter to the bishops of Italy and Gaul. Now, let me tell you of what happened 2 weeks or so ago in the United Methodist Church at a special session of their General Conference in the United States, where they have been divided, as all the Protestant churches are, over these sexuality issues. But they voted for a traditional plan, and that one defeated the vote of the lobby for one church plan. The result was that it expands definition of self-avowed homosexuals to include persons living in a same-sex marriage or union, or who publicly proclaim themselves to be practicing homosexuals. Explicitly prohibits bishops from consecrating bishops, ordaining or commissioning clergy who are self-avowed practicing homosexuals. Establishes a minimum penalty for clergy convicted of performing a same-sex wedding of a 1-year suspension, first offence, and loss of credentials, second offence. Explicitly prohibits district committee and conference board of ministry from recommending a candidate for ministry who does not meet the standards, and orders the bishop to declare any such unqualified candidate out of order. And that was just 2 weeks ago, and is the first Protestant church to make a stand, mainstream church in the United States, or as far as we know, anywhere, in this current sad situation. I was reminded at breakfast, let me just say this in passing, that we don't like, well, I don't like having to talk about these things all the time, but our church was founded on the principle, or with a vision for, these are the words, maintaining and promulgating sound scriptural and evangelical truth. And that's very profound, actually, because it's truth that we're here for. And not you make your own truth, there is the truth. What is the truth? It's evangelical truth. That's the truth as it is about Jesus, the gospel. But which Jesus? That's the real crunch. Well, it's the scriptural evangelical truth, the scriptural Jesus. But all sorts of people are wanting to be scriptural these days, but your exegesis has to be sound. And we thought about some of that yesterday. But when you've got all that, you've got to do two things all the time. You've got to maintain it and proclaim it. If you don't maintain it, you don't have a gospel to proclaim. If you only proclaim it, soon you can find yourself proclaiming something that is not the gospel. And at the moment in the church, the wider church, we have to attend to these issues, unpleasant though they are. I just say that in passing, that's not in my notes, that's just something we need to keep in mind all the time. Well, last year at the Jesmond conference, our subject was sexual chaos, and that was the first one we dealt with anything sexually in these conferences. And we had some suggestions based on the three things needed for the health and survival of any human society. One, a domestic order, that's marriage and the family. Two, a political order, that includes government and economics. And three, a spiritual order. So a key agenda item then and now needs to be the restoring of marriage and the family, both for the sake of the church and the state. And action is called for in the Church of England now, independently of the dysfunctional General Synod, where, as Philip Turner says, what parades as reflection and dialogue, on the whole, is no more than impassioned repetition within a politically controlled space of hardened positions. What are the facts on marriage from the Office of National Statistics? Well, the latest figures are the 2018 figures, report that marriage rates for opposite-sex couples are now at their lowest level on record, following a gradual long-term decline since the early 1970s. The number of marriages between opposite-sex couples decreased by 3.4% in 2015 compared with 2014, which is the last, I imagine, figures they've got for that. So what are the particular causes we must address in the Church of England for what is happening? For obviously there are many factors. Well, first, a major problem is the destabilising of the sexual culture by extreme feminism and homosexualism, both of which, especially the latter, punch far above their weight for a range of reasons. There are only 2% lesbian, gay and bisexual people, and a tiny percentage point extra for transgendered, according to the Office for National Statistics. However, for example, the BBC has pledged that by next year, 8% of its workforce will be LGBT, and the Church of England has been not insignificant, I'm afraid, in promoting unawares such homosexualism and giving it a level of supposed divine sanction. Secondly, modern Marcionism in the Church of England has been a very serious but subtle cause of our problem. Marcion, in the 2nd century, adopted the heresy of only wanting Paul, or portions of Paul and parts of Luke, as his Bible. He rejected the God of the Old Testament and much of Jesus' teaching that has come down to us. And he certainly rejected the pastoral letters of Paul and the general letters of James, Peter, John, Jude, and also Revelation. A soft in Marcionism has been standard fare among many liberal theologians, and so then among the leadership in both church and state today in our country. They do not entirely copy Marcion. Instead of rejecting those New Testament books, they then accord them second division status. So when those books speak politically incorrectly, such as Jude on Sodom and some clear teaching in Revelation, they are glossed over, ignored, and their implications disobeyed. But Thomas Oden says, by contrast, when we allow ourselves to be addressed by these letters, however, we discover to our amazement that they represent not a deterioration, but a marvellously spirited, vital, and maturing phase of early Christian theological development. They struggle with the meaning of ordination. They continue at the continuity and stability of the tradition, the nature of the pastoral office, the criteria for doctrinal definition, and the distinction between heterodoxy and orthodoxy, all issues that face us today. And these are problems that could not have been taken up until the Church had gained several decades of experience and had faced up to the reality that it would have to continue to deal with ongoing history, governmental authority, and serious challenges to it from within and from without. So what was the situation in the wider world towards the end of the 1st century? Well, the crucial question before the churches then was, how in a period of cross-cultural pluralism, syncretism, political alienation, and vast historical mutation, is it possible to pass the tradition learned from the earliest Christians on to the succeeding generations? How can we teach it accurately without distortions, and how can we defend it against interpretations that would profoundly diminish it? It is a life and death question that echoes in our situation today. And of course, the early church solved the problem by a clear canon of apostolic teaching, the Bible, namely the books that make up the Bible, by an institutional leadership that was male, when, by the way, outside Pharisaic Judaism, there was significant feminism in the ancient world, by a fierce struggle against heresy, and by the discipline of the heterodox. So thirdly, this has meant the expurgation of the biblical doctrine of judgment and hell from those books, not least Revelation, but also from the clear teaching of Jesus. And now that was brought home to me recently, for a main lectionary reading at funerals is Revelation 21. This is the set reading, one of the set readings. Its first few verses contain those familiar words, he will wipe away every tear, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain, and so on. But the reading stops at verse 7. It admits verse 8, the natural conclusion of that section. Verse 8 reads, "But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, and homosexually active people," from the Greek word used, "as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." And that is never heard. But we need to recover somehow a consciousness of hell as another reality. The reality where, as C.S. Lewis says, sinners prefer self-righteousness to the righteousness of God, and the deformed sense of satisfaction from holding on to bitterness, resentment, and hurt to the joys at God's right hand. Whether Lewis is precisely true, what is true sociologically is that belief in hell is correlated with reduced crime rates. That's from an article in The Economist. What is also true is the wipeout of the BCP Commination service from the ASB Common Worship and even the English Prayer Book. That service of God's curses on sins is for the use on the first day of Lent. However, Archbishop Welby actually used the old BCP version on 10th of February 2016, Ash Wednesday. There has been no revision of it for ASB or Common Worship, so Welby's action was so rare it merited national news coverage. But good for Welby of that, because the service interestingly starts like this. "Brethren, in the primitive church there was a godly discipline, that at the beginning of Lent, such persons as stood convicted of notorious sin were put in open penance and punished in this world, that their souls might be saved in the day of the Lord, and that others, admonished by their example, might be the more afraid to offend. Instead whereof, until the said discipline may be restored again, which is much to be wished, it is thought good that at this time, in the presence of you all, should be read the general sentences of God's cursing against impenitent sinners." So this is an authority for the consideration of restoring discipline in the church. Fourthly, another theological reason is Burke's dictum of evil prevailing when good men do nothing. Now this is back to the possible difference between Luther and Calvin, or rather Lutheranism and Calvinism. Luther and Augustine held that the state is a post-fall institution to respond to human sin by upholding the common good and executing limited judgment over the community on the basis of a higher law. Its main task was, in the words of Romans 13, to bear the sword and bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Calvinism and Thomas Aquinism, those that follow him, on the other side, believed that the state was part of God's creative intention. At any rate, Romans 13 verse 3 and getting the state's approval for doing good suggests a more positive role for the state. And the Church of England is clearly by establishment on that side, believing that's the right way of proceeding. Whether this is the root of the problem or not, there today is a very great difference to many others in a well-known Christian whose book was plugged last year at Keswick. In it you read the following. The author was referring to being asked to back a campaign to oppose the law on blasphemy. But he argues this, that this was, I quote, a more extreme example of Christendom thinking. He opposes Christendom. But similar attitudes are reflected when Christians campaign on issues like Christian involvement in broadcasting, the provision of state-funded Christian schools, the requirement for mainly Christian religious education, Christian assemblies in state schools, the retention of a specifically Christian coronation oath. Latent Christendom thinking is often revealed in the attitude of Christians to education. When we argue that Christianity should be taught in schools and that it should be the dominant religion taught because it is the historic religion of the country, then we are thinking along Christendom lines. Well, much more in line with Anglicanism are the Americans, Tom Minory and Glenn Stanton, in a paper on, quotes, family integrity. And they wrote this: "Our society has been reshaping marriage and the family into oblivion. Nearly all of this reshaping is measurably harmful to society and human well-being. And there's something all faithful Christians should oppose. So how do we prophetically and redemptively challenge this change? What is more, how do we do this in an increasingly pluralistic society? First is to realize that Christ has called us to engage the culture. It is a sin to remain silent." There is a citation to back this up. "To say our task is solely to lead others to Christ and believe the rest will work itself out, as some Christians do, is shamefully simplistic and fails to recognize the fullness of the lordship of Christ over all of creation, including public life." They then argue that we are not Gnostic, and so we must not argue that our faith is unrelated to the real world of flesh and blood. Therefore, we can persuade from the perspective of human well-being, for God doesn't make us his directives for reasons that have no impact on the lives of those he loves. We must show that when we move away from God's ideal for the family, people suffer. And Minner and Stanton then proceed a galaxy of facts to show the connection between God's rule for family life and the way it corresponds with human and societal well-being. Our Lord's two great commandments, love God and love neighbour, demand we concern ourselves for the health of the family at home and in the public square. God created the family uniquely to reflect his nature and the glory of the church in the world, and our neighbour's well-being is deeply rooted in the health of their family. And the fifth factor is when bishops act illegally by teaching, by sleight of hand or by tongue, that homosexual sex is legitimate. For they can seek to canvass support by talking about respecting each person as a child of God, with which we all agree, and before you know where you are, you seem to be respecting their lifestyle choices. But to respect an identity self-chosen because of a temptation that is indulged, enjoyed and celebrated is not open to the Christian. For the Bible says the indulgence in this temptation, in the euphemism of the bishops, is especially dishonourable. The Bible calls it an abomination. And as serious as anything episcopal was a previous set of bishops overseeing the modern language prayer book and the marriage service. They did not stop the alteration of the three purposes of marriage, and nor did any of us who were in any way involved in that service. The Book of Common Prayer is clear. The first cause is that it was ordained for the procreation of children, to be brought up in the fear and nurture of the Lord. The second was for the satisfactions of physical sex, and the third for love, for the mutual society, help and comfort that the one ought to have of the other, both in prosperity and adversity. But in the revision, love was made the primary, and having children was downgraded. Immediately, it was, of course, open to homosexual people to claim that they could fulfill the first purpose of marriage. So why should marriage be closed to them? As we think we must, and now as we think what we must do in this situation, we need to be careful. Both in the mainstream and in our smaller groups, we must work for unity. We must keep in mind Ephesians 4, verse 2, and be with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And we do have to work for that and work out how that works out. At the same time, we must, this is Ephesians 4 later on, no longer be children tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine. Listen to this, I always do, we have to be so careful. By human cunning, by craftiness, in deceitful schemes. And that is what we're up against. Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. And finally, what is needed is deep change. And that is a business category for large companies that are in slow death. Change won't come from the senior management. Those folk are simply working their way towards a pension and keeping their heads down. The bright young things with no loyalty to the company simply jump ship and get security elsewhere. What is needed is deep change. That is where someone or someones embedded in the company see the issues and take action. The person usually has to break the rules, which are strangling the company to death. And accordingly, he risks his job. And he doesn't have a neat business plan with the future all mapped out, because he can't have. He just does what is immediately necessary and reasonable as far as he can see. And that's not very far. So he has to manage to build his bridge while he's crossing over it. And that is what I believe we have to do in our situation.